mode.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Cheryl Welbeck. I'm a project manager for Directors of Health Promotion and Education. Welcome to today's webinar, which is Sustaining Your Work, Grant Writing Basics. Before we begin today, a few reminders. Everyone's line should be on mute for today's presentation. I'd like to call to your attention the fact that there's a control panel to your right. The control panel has a couple of options that may be useful for you during today's presentation. One of which is a question box located at the bottom of the control panel. If you have any issues with audio or technical type questions, you can type those either into the question box or the chat box, and I'll try to get to those. Additionally, there's an option to raise hands if you need some special assistance during today's presentation. Today's webinar will be recorded and archived in the online group on the DHPE website, and we'd like to ask you to hold questions until the end of today's presentation. Today's speaker is Melanie J. Wells, who's the Assistant Chief Executive Officer at SOPHE, the Society for Public Health Education. And Melanie is a health administration professional with over 17 years of experience serving medically vulnerable communities in urban and rural settings. Her areas of expertise and experience include full cycle grant administration, project management, nonprofit governance, and strategic planning. Ms. Wells has diverse experiences in the health market, in university medical centers, nonprofits, community-based clinics, secondary education, and research settings. And she has developed funding proposals and managed a portfolio of public health projects spanning HIV/AIDS, cancer patient navigation, minority health, and health disparity issues. Welcome to today's webinar, Melanie.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And thank you, everyone, for taking a few moments out of your afternoon to learn about grant writing basics. As Cheryl mentioned, I've been doing this type of work for a number of years, and on this particular project, I serve as the principal investigator for SOPHE's role in our National Implementation and Dissemination for Chronic Disease Prevention project. And specifically within our office, I'm responsible for leading all of our vetting and proposal development activities. Next slide, please, Cheryl. So during our time today, I just want to provide a few overarching strategies that hopefully will be helpful for you and your organization as you move forward with identifying funding opportunities and ways that you can continue to sustain the work that you're currently doing. In addition, we'll talk briefly about keys to vetting opportunities, and I'll share with you a template that we use that we found to be helpful in our proposal development activities. Then we'll go through some basics around preparing the response. There are a few sections that are normally required regardless of the funding agency or funder that you're applying to. So it's helpful if you're able to develop responses to those sections ahead of time to help alleviate some of the stress that you may encounter in developing your proposal. And lastly, we'll talk about some reminders that you should keep in mind as you submit your actual proposal. And then at the close today, we'll have a few moments for questions. Next slide, please. So the one thing I'd like you to keep in mind is that you can do this. And one television show that came to mind that I thought related quite well to what you may experience as a grant writer is Worst Cooks in America. And this is a reality competition show on the Food Network where they take about 12 to 16 contestants who are called recruits who are very poor cooks. And they go through an 8-week culinary boot camp with the goal of earning a $25,000 cash prize and a Food Network cooking set. So if you see the picture in the bottom left corner, these are some early recruits. And they look overwhelmed, they look stressed, they look as if they don't know their way well around the kitchen. But in the end, they're transformed into chefs. And so I think this really demonstrates oftentimes what the process may feel like if you're approaching grant writing or proposal development without a plan. So our goal is hopefully today to shift you from the novice on the left to someone who's confident in your ability to develop funding proposals. Next slide, please. So the part of the grant life cycle that our conversation today will really focus on It's identifying funding, which Susan Geckler talked about in great deal in the first of this webinar series. And then also preparing your proposal and then your proposal submission. So stages 2 through 4 are really where our focus will be today. Next slide, please. So in terms of overarching strategies, I just wanted to note that many nonprofit organizations do not have full-time grant writers or development staff. So responding to proposals often requires staff to maintain their normal responsibilities while developing the application. So a few strategies that will help reduce stress and improve the function of your development team include just developing a process. You need to establish a method well before a potential opportunity becomes available that defines how your organization will approach responding to the proposal. You also need to determine what are funding priorities for your organization. Specifically, it helps to know what types of projects your organization would like to expand or sustain. This will allow you to be proactive instead of responsive to funding opportunities or requests for proposals that become available. That greatly ties to identifying key funders. Once you are aware of the types of projects your organization would like to fund, you can identify federal agencies, private funders, and foundations who support these types of projects. Susan Geckler, in the first presentation of this webinar series, described in great detail a number of resources that can help you in that research. Next, I would encourage you to maintain your registration. For federal awards, an organization must have a DUNS number, be registered in a SAM system, as well as registered on grants.gov. It is important to keep these registrations up to date, as the verification process for some systems may take several days, and you don't want to jeopardize being able to submit an application due to an outdated registration. And the last overarching strategy is just select a team. Identify a group of individuals who will be involved in the grant development process. It's easier to manage this process if you have specific roles assigned to individuals in your staff that aligns with their areas of expertise. Next slide, please. So next we want to talk about vetting opportunities. And this image also demonstrates someone who's emotionally distressed and looks a little overwhelmed. And I hope that in this portion of the conversation we'll provide you with some tools that will help you in the reviewing process. Next slide. So in terms of vetting process, there are 3 primary steps that I'd like to discuss. The first is just developing a process. The next slide, I will show you the template that my organization uses to evaluate whether a funding opportunity or request for a proposal is really valid for our organization. Not only do you want to develop a process, but you also want to determine what is your selection criteria. What things will you take into account when you're making a decision whether or not your team should invest the time in responding to an FOA or request for proposal. And lastly, you want to review opportunities periodically. I would encourage you, once you have your funding opportunities identified, you know the vetting process that you're going to go through, you know what agencies provide funding for the type of work that you're doing, at least on a quarterly basis, set aside a meeting where your team members have done some research to see if there are any FOAs or requests for proposals that will be coming available soon, just so you can get ahead of the game and not always be responsive when the request hits the street. Next slide, please. So this is the first page of the template that we use internally for vetting opportunities. The summary on our team is prepared by the member of the proposal development team that has the greatest level of expertise in that particular area. So actually, in order to prepare this summary, someone would need to read in full detail the funding opportunity announcement or the request for proposal. That really serves as a recipe if you want to continue in the food analogy that I made earlier. The FOA instructions really guide the work that you're going to be doing. So over the next few slides, I'll go specifically into each of the sections that are included in this opportunity summary. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's most important for us, is one of the first things that we consider is whether this is new business or follow up on something that we've already done. We want to identify whether or not this agency, we would be a new client, a current client, or if it's someone that we've had a relationship with in the past. In addition to that, you just want some basic information about the opportunity. What's the name of the opportunity? Is there a website that other team members can go to find out more information? Who is the funding agency or the client that's providing the funding? Who's the contract officer? This is the person where you would direct questions about developing your proposal to. You want to know whether or not this is a new opportunity or if it's a continuation of previous work for the funding agency, and then who ultimately will be the project officer. So all of these things are helpful so you would know where to go if you have additional questions regarding the response that you're developing to the FOA. Next slide, please. The next portion of this particular summary that we evaluate is what is the value of the award that the request for proposal is for. Is it worth, and the reason why we pay attention to that is we want to make sure that it's worth the time of our staff to develop their proposal for the amount of money that is being released for this award. And there have been times when the funding was just so low that we've made the decision that it's not worth the staff time to invest. So that's one of the reasons why the value of the award is important. Next, you want to know when was the award released, because oftentimes we know that applying to federal opportunities or funding opportunities is a competitive process. You want to make sure that you have enough time with your staff to develop a response that will be competitive. In the award purpose section is a place where we provide just a summary. Normally it comes from the section of the FOA called Executive Summary, where we provide a summary of what the funder is expecting awardees to do. Then we talk about past or similarly funded projects, meaning are there other things that our organization has done that's quite similar to this type of work, because those are things that we need to make sure that we include in our organizational description, which we'll talk about in a few moments. We also take a few minutes to consider, are there potential partners? Are there other organizations that it might be useful for us to contact and include as we develop this proposal? From the very beginning of your conversations around a request for proposal or funding opportunity, you want to be clear about the proposal due date and how you're supposed to submit your final application. You don't want to jeopardize all the work that you've done because you missed the date inadvertently. Next slide, please. So this is page 2 of our opportunity, and I actually left in information so you could see the entire page, and now we're going to talk about the different segments of it. Next slide. So one of the things that we do is we take a moment to consider, are we competitive for this funding opportunity? And so to do that, we take a deeper dive into the scope of work that's listed in the FOA. And so most funding opportunities give you very specific details about what the awardees are expected to do if they're successful in receiving the dollars for that particular application. Next, we want to identify the individuals who are going to be responsible for developing the budget. Depending on your the size of your organization, you may or may not need to do that. We also want to be clear about how long is the funded project. What type of award is it? Is it a cooperative agreement? Is it a grant? Is it just an opportunity where once you're approved, the funder gives you the dollars and you pretty much have free reign to move forward with your project? You want to be clear about the type of award. Next, you want to make sure that you read the eligibility requirements that are listed in the FOA to make sure that your organization is eligible to apply. And you want to be clear about the number of awards that will be given for a specific region or time period. We also take time to list to pay attention to if there are any pre-proposal calls or meetings that will be held. And what the pre-proposal call or meeting is it's a time for the funder to go over a funding opportunity and answer any questions that individuals may have who are planning to apply. Next, you want to be aware of if a letter of intent is required. And generally, a letter of intent is just a note to the funder that says who your organization is, what opportunity you're planning to apply for, and really that's for the funder to make sure that they have enough reviewers in place for the demand that they're anticipating for a specific award. We also make note of when questions are due to the funder to make sure that we're on par or on the right page in terms of how we're developing our proposal. Again, we are constantly reminding ourselves of the due date, and we also establish an internal deadline. I'll talk about that a little more later in the presentation, but we try to build in at least a day or two for internal review before we submit our final application. And lastly, we pay attention to, once the work is complete, when can we anticipate receiving the award if we're successful in our application efforts. Next slide, please. So what this slide goes into further detail is we want to be clear about what are the awardee requirements. What is the funder expecting for agencies who are successful in applying to this work? In addition, we also talk about the evaluation criteria. Every funding opportunity generally lists specifics about how proposals will be evaluated by the proposal reviewers. Next slide, please. So this is a continuation of the evaluation criteria, and here we actually took the time to lay out the specific areas of the FOA that were required, as well as the points that were allotted to each of those sections. And the points help you determine how much time should you give to each of those sections. In addition, we have a section that we call red flags, meaning if there are things that are listed in the FOA that would be problematic for our organization to complete, or deficits that we see that we have, we want to identify those early on in the process to make sure that we either have partners to help us complete those or fill those gaps. Next slide, please. I just talked about this. One more, please. Thank you. So also in the vetting process, we take time to think about who are the members of our staff who would be ideal to bid on a particular project. We also want to be clear about the proposal guidelines, and this includes how many pages the FOA is, what is the font size, what is the margin size that's required. You want to make sure that you're clear about those things so that at the last minute you're not scrambling trying to adapt your proposal to meet the needs of the FOA. In addition, we also make a final decision during this preliminary conversation. Once this funding summary is developed by a team member, our team sits down, we talk through it, we talk through our win strategies, we talk through strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and we make a decision if we're going to apply for the opportunity or not. And if we are, then we develop what our next steps are to make sure that we're online and have a project timeline to complete this within the deadline of the FOA. Next slide. So next we want to talk about preparing for the response for the FOA. Next slide. So just a few important reminders. Make sure that you address the required sections of the FOA. Oftentimes, our proposals can be really dense in terms of content. So feel free to summarize things using graphs, tables, or appropriate images, or even call-out boxes if you'd like to bring the reviewer's attention to a specific section. Make sure that you follow the formatting guidelines. And again, I'll keep saying this, please allow time for proofreading. And I would encourage that you allow time for someone in your office who may not be involved in the proposal development process. It's great to have someone with a fresh set of eyes to review your proposal. Next slide, please. So in terms of standard proposal components, Generally, you're going to have to provide organizational information, a statement of the need or the problem, a work plan or specific activities that you plan to complete during the project, outcomes or the impact of your activities, the evaluation, and the budget. So we will go into further detail about each of these sections. Next slide, please. So in terms of organizational information, you want to make sure that you clearly define the mission of your organization. Let the funder know who's your target audience. Who do you serve? What are the unique attributes of your organization? What's your primary location? Who are the key leaders within your organization and then the staff that will be working on this project? In addition, in the organizational information section is an opportunity to provide a record of your organization's previous achievements in this particular area of expertise. And then also you want to give some sense of the budget size of your organization so that the funder will know how this fits into the portfolio of work that you currently have. Next slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit more about the statement of the problem. Don't assume that your funder knows a great deal about your subject area. Oftentimes, those who review applications have a general knowledge of the subject matter. So you want to use this section to describe why is this particular issue important. And you want to describe that using two different trains of thought. You want to be factual. Provide data that demonstrates you're expert in this particular field and well capable of doing the work that you'll be proposing in your application. But you also want to provide a human interest. Why will people benefit from this work if you're successfully funded? You also want to describe your issue in a local context. You may relate the problem to a national issue, but you want to bring it to your local community or the defined community that you'll be working with so that the funder is clear about how your target audience will benefit from the work that you're proposing. Lastly, you want to provide context around the solution that you're proposing and the problem. And what I try to demonstrate with these words here is that you don't want to provide a solution that's too small to really make an impact on the problem. So you want to make sure that when you describe the statement of need, that you don't diminish the problem, but that you describe it in a way where your solution is clear to solve something to make a significant difference in the problem. Next slide, please. So next is the work plan or specific activity. So similar to how our team creates a strategy of how they're going to win a game, the work plan does that for your proposal. It's a place where you're able to provide your overall goals, provide detailed information about your target audience, and the specific activities that you plan to complete if your proposal is successful and awarded. You also want to take a few moments to describe your prior project planning. If your team has done any work to prepare for this work before the FOA has been submitted. You also want to identify who are going to be the key personnel to actually implement the work if you're funded, and provide a clear timeline based on when the funding is supposed to be awarded and how your team will ramp up, complete the project, and bring it to a close. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of preparing the response, there will be a section that's required where you're able to describe your outcomes and the impact. You want to share how will the problem change as the result of the project that you're proposing. It's ideal to use information that's quantifiable, but sometimes that's difficult to do. So that's how evaluation comes into play. You want to be able to describe how you will know that your desired outcomes are reached. So this is the area where you describe the data that you'll be collecting, the collection process that you will use, as well as how you will analyze that data to determine whether or not your organization is successful in completing its proposed activities for the project. Next slide, please. The next portion of the proposal is your budget. And here you want to provide a thoughtful outline of the cost of the project. This often includes personnel costs, direct expenses, which could be travel, expenses for projects or programs that are components of the overall project, and any overhead expenses. Also, in your budget and budget narrative, it will be an opportunity for you to describe if there is other funding in your organization that supports the type of work that is being proposed in the project. Next slide, please. So once you, with your team, have developed the proposal, the next step is actually submitting the proposal. And there are just a few reminders I'd like to bring to your attention here. Next slide, please. Please, please, please allow time for review. Oftentimes when you're engrossed in the process of developing a proposal, you become so connected to information that you might miss if the content doesn't flow well. So it's great to have other individuals within your organization who weren't involved in the proposal development process to proofread the final product, to make sure that your proposal follows the proposal guidelines, to check for content and flow of the information, and also just to do a check for grammar. Next slide, please. Again, do not miss the deadline. Unfortunately, I can say that over my career, there have been a few moments when our team has spent a lot of time developing a proposal, and because we either didn't check our registration or we weren't paying attention to some of the guidelines in the FOA, we missed the deadline, and that's quite frustrating for a team. So I would encourage you to have a proposal guide or a team lead who makes sure that the group is moving forward on a timeline so that you're able to complete the proposal and submit it well before the deadline. Next slide, please. So once you've submitted your proposal, I would encourage you, while that experience is fresh on the team's mind, have a debrief. Ask your team members what worked well, what can we improve for the next time, and what did we learn from this experience? And based on that conversation, be willing to adapt your proposal development strategy for future submissions. Next slide, please. So going back to the worst cooks in America, even if you start a proposal development process and you feel as if your skills are a little underdeveloped, through time and practice, you can become a master chef and create masterpieces as well that are demonstrated here. So I hope that this presentation has been helpful for you. And at this time, Cheryl, we can transition to the next slide, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may have come in.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. As a reminder to folks who are listening today, if you have any questions, you can ask in one of two ways. You can either raise your hand and I can unmute your line, or there's a question box at the bottom of your control panel and you can type your question in there and we will address questions in the order that they come in. So while folks are gathering their thoughts to see if they have any questions, Melanie, the tool that you've described that SOPHE uses is very useful. Is there any chance that SOPHE might be willing to share a version of that template or tool with folks who are on today's call?
Yes, that's a great question, Cheryl. I'm happy to share that tool as well as an article that I think was very helpful. It was entitled Writing a Successful Grant Proposal, and it was created by the Minnesota Council of Foundations. So I'm happy to share those resources with the group and attendees following today's webinar.
Okay, that's great. Melanie, I really like the analogy between the cooking show and the submission process for grants. I know that the process is several steps long and it can be very intense. But I think the description for breaking down the steps and using the tools is going to be helpful for folks on today's call. One thing
Great,
that I
thank
wanted to talk about or get back to, one of the things that you described in your tool was an area called red flags, where you talked a
you.
little bit about if you're doing an analysis of a opportunity and realize that there may be a weakness within in the organization or perhaps a deficit that you might consider several ways to address that, one of which was working with other partners. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So generally within our organization, if we come to a point where we identify a red flag, first we think through, because SOPHE is a membership organization, we talk through whether or not we have members who could help us fill that void. If we recognize that within SOPHE's membership we don't have that connection, the next thought process we go through is, does this exclude us from applying to this award? Meaning, should we now consider reaching out to other organizations and partnering with them where they're actually leading the application process and SOPHE is a subcontractor? Or do we think that we can find a partner organization where SOPHE still serves as the lead, but that partner will fill that gap? So a red flag just means these are areas where we recognize that we may have some deficiencies and need additional support to fill those. And the only time where we come to a point where we stop the process is if we recognize there is a deficiency, we don't have a way to fill that with our partners, or we don't know any other organizations who are serving as the prime for the application that we could offer our support as a subcontractor. Those are times when those red flags are helpful, because then we recognize this just may not be a good fit for us at this time in our organization.
Okay, thank you. Under what circumstances, I noticed that contact information for the funder is included in the tool that you're using. Under what circumstances would your organization consider contacting the funder?
If there are questions that we have about the FOA and we have not, for whatever reason, if we miss the meeting, the pre-proposal meeting or pre-proposal call, or we don't have access to archived information, we would reach out to the contract officer and share any questions that we have around developing our response to the FOA. And generally, they'll have frequently asked questions that they can share with you that can help you develop your response. But that's generally when we would reach out to the contract officer.
Okay. As a reminder, folks, you can type your question either in the chat box or in the question box at the very bottom of your control panel. Melanie, in developing your response for a target audience, by target audience, are we talking about the reviewers or in general the funder and the types of things they fund? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So when I mentioned target audience, and that's under, I believe, organizational information, but that's actually the group who will benefit most from the work that you're proposing in your scope of work.
Okay.
So the target audience is actually the group who will benefit from your work plan or specific activities of the project.
Okay, thank you. Last call for questions. Please type them into the question box at the bottom. Melanie, while we're waiting for folks to submit any last thoughts they might have or questions, one more question for me. You talked a little bit about statement of problem, and that the statement of the problem should both be factual but also to pique human interest. Can we talk a little bit specifically for folks who are working on the National Implementation Project, how use of their needs assessment data might be helpful in stating the statement of problem?
Sure. So it's important to start with the factual information. So the data that you've collected from your needs assessment will be essential in developing that section. But also you want to frame it from the sense of, for instance, if we use an area that may have a food desert, and just telling the story. It may take an individual, if they want to have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, they may have to ride on public transportation for over an hour, or there may not be a store that's close to them where they're able to access healthy food. So when you provide the data that shows the number of people who are actually eating or have access to healthy food and beverage choices in a particular area, you want to tell the story as to why, so that the funder understands it's not just that people may not want to eat healthy, but there may be a real challenge that prevents them, or barrier that prevents them from doing that. And that just provides a platform for you to be able to show how your project can meet that need.
Okay, and Melanie, we do have a question in the question box right now. Someone is asking, do you have to go through all of these steps for foundation applications or applications for corporate funding?
Generally, no. So generally when you have an FOA application, you may have a page limit of up to 25 pages that includes all of these sections. Generally, when you are responding or reaching out for a corporate sponsor, that's really a relationship. And once you develop the rapport, in terms of the request, oftentimes they only want 1 to 2 pages of information, but you would cover these sections. So you would provide 1 to 2 paragraphs about your organizational information, 1 to 2 paragraphs about the statement of need, 1 to 2 paragraphs about your work plan, and then, of course, the budget. So you would cover all of these sections if you're applying to a corporate sponsor or a foundation. It's just that you won't provide the level of detail, because those applications generally range from 1 to 5 pages in terms of their page limitation.
Okay. Okay, there's another question here. This one is, okay, is it beneficial for organizations to have a master application proposal that can be tailored for future opportunities, or should an organization start from scratch each time?
Definitely the first option that was stated. It's great. One of the reasons why I listed these sections for preparing the proposal is that once you create a process, it makes it easier on the staff who are involved if you are able to replicate that process versus starting from scratch. What we've often done with SOPHE, specifically related to the section around organizational information, we really have key language that we include in every funding opportunity that we submit. There are sections that we can adapt it to make it more specific to a particular FOA, but we at least have the standard listed there, and it's easy to move forward. Because what you want to do when you create standard language, then you can really focus on the areas that are unique to that FOA. What is the specific work plan and activities? What's the specific budget? What are you going to do that's innovative? So it's definitely helpful to have some base language that you use over and over for your organization, specifically around the areas that don't change.
Okay. Okay, are there any other questions for Melanie Wells at this time? Okay. If not, we will go ahead and conclude today's webinar a little bit early. I would like to thank Melanie for today's presentation and thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to participate in today's webinar. A couple of reminders, there will be a feedback survey at the conclusion of today's webinar. We'd like to encourage all of you to complete that. Additionally, the next event on the National Implementation and Dissemination for Chronic Disease Prevention Initiative is a webinar on this Monday, which is November 16th. Monday's webinar is on communicating data to move audiences to action. It's a recorded webinar followed by a live Q&A session. If you have not registered for that event, I do encourage folks to register for that. Melanie, thank you once again for your presentation today. And if you think I'm sorry, Melanie, go ahead.
No, I just said thank you for the opportunity, that's all.
Okay, great. With that, we're going to go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Thank you all for your time this afternoon.